Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Zul. Um, as always, it's very nice to hear you talking. And as a politician, I think there was a very good kind of expression of this topic that we're discussing today. And okay, okay. All right. Yeah. Inshallah. So I think it's time for us to basically express your views on this topic, be precise. Can I have this? And I think one of you can I pass it around, Julia? Can you pass it around? If you have any questions, introduce yourself first, then address your question. Thank you. Dr. Nader first.
Dr. Farouk, first I'd like to thank you for bringing Dr. Nader Hashemi again.
Thank you.
And Dr. Hashemi, thank you very much. I attended your lecture last year in July, and you introduced the twin toleration, and today you added more to my whatever little knowledge I have. I have a lot of questions, but I'm not going to hog the microphone. But I want to take this opportunity to talk on behalf of G25. G25's concern on the two very important concepts that Hashemi put forward. One is the 3 dimensions of secularism. And what G25 is facing today is exactly that. We are promoting political secularism. We are devout Muslims ourselves, individuals. You know, we are not looking at the philosophical or societal level, but we have been labeled as people who are anti-Islamic, as individuals. They cannot see that difference. The religious authorities and even among our friends, they cannot see that difference that we are looking for. We are fighting for political secularism, and we want and we continue to be good Muslims ourselves. So that is one of the challenges that G25 is facing at the moment. They have really tarnished our image. The second thing is quite related to that, is your concept on the word secular. I mean, we all 3 of you mentioned that, and in July you mentioned that as well, and Rashid Ghanouchi said, let's not just use the word secular, it has too much baggage in it. Now, one of the repeated themes that Isham particularly, of the religious authority, has been attacking G25, in fact they mentioned Tan Sri Syariah's name individually, is that show us the word secular in the federal constitution. We have Article 3.1. They say that Islam is the religion of the federation. It doesn't have the word official there. It is the religion. The word secular is not there. So we've been cracking our head. When the time comes that we can have an opportunity to debate with them, I think the time will come because we are writing a report on them, a study on them. And some of the arguments I would like to put forth is exactly what you 3 speakers have said. The word secular itself is so problematic. Putting it in an article in a federal constitution would not serve any purpose. It will only make things worse. Secondly, India is about the only country I know that has a constitution. The first article says India is a secular country. Has it served India well? Today you see India saffronized. It's a totally Hindu nation. So having the word secular is really not useful. And thirdly, of course, Tunisia in 2014, that very wonderful constitution that they have put forward. The word secular is not there. They put the values of secularism. And that's what our federal constitution is like. So I'm sorry to take so much time. I have lots of questions, but I'm sure other people have lots of questions as well.
Maitri from one village or Satu Kampung. Okay, I'm like Dr. Dzulkefly. I'm not here to talk about politics, but about creation. You see, when we talk about whatever subject, we are talking like about a fruit. A fruit has got 2 parts, the seed and the flesh. So, if you talk about the seed part, that is what you meant on aspect. And when you talk about the flesh, that is the secular part. And you cannot have one without the other. So, basically, let's go to the first part, which is the seed. You know, in the seed itself, it grows in the tree. And the tree itself has got 5 parts. First part is the root. You agree with me? The root you cannot see, is below the ground. The second part is the trunk. And so the root is actually what you call as your race. Okay. The trunk is what we mean by religion. You see, so religion springs out from the root race. Okay. Now, what stretches out from the religion, that is called the culture, the branch that comes from the trunk. Are you following my vision? All right.
Can you be brief?
Okay, and then from there you comes up the third part, which is the leaves. So the leaves is the ideological part of your whole concept, and only the final part, which is the tree, that is what is called the fruit. That is what is called the nation. So if we want to put it in the right perspective, I think there is no need for any argument. The solution is very clear and simple.
Only one question, or I can give two? Okay. The first question is about when we first met Professor Hashemi in 2014. I asked you one question about, you argued in the book that the difficult process within Christianity in Europe, the transition from a religious society into a secular society, is a difficult and a bloody one. So they need to go through wars, they need to go through revolutions in order to become a liberal and secular society like they have now. So you also argue that that difficult process is currently happening in Muslim society, and the difficult process to secularize Muslim society now can be analogized into Europe. So you have answered the question 3 years back, but for the benefit of the audience today, how can we justify the analogy between 15th, 16th century Europe with the Muslim society that we have now? Some Islamists will argue that we are in different contexts altogether. So how do we justify the analogy? That's the first question. The second question is about when we talk about the relationship between religion and the state, we also need to be critical towards the ontology of the state. This has been argued by Wa'il Halab in his Impossible State. Maybe this question can also be answered by Dr. Isham. So any modern state will be built on national myth. So we know that America got its own national myth, and so does Malaysia. So because of that national myth, we will instill patriotism in our citizens, and our citizens will religiously be patriotic towards the state. So when we subscribe to this patriotic ideal to be a citizen of a modern state, then basically, even if the state is rejecting any organized religion, in the end, the existence of the modern state itself will be a kind of new belief on the masses. So when we believe in this bureaucratic and omnipotent state, a total omnipotence modern state, we are actually changing our belief from religion to be the supreme ruler of people to a new religion, which is the modern bureaucratic state. Now, the modern state cannot be truly secular. What's your comment on this?
Yeah, in my book, when I talk about the comparison between the very difficult process of modernization in Europe that really begins in the 15th, 16th century and then moves forward, and it was bloody and it was contentious, and I draw a comparison to the contemporary Islamic world, I'm not making the argument. I'm not claiming that the process, the level of conflict, the pathway that Europe followed is going to be identical to what's happening in the Islamic world today. Obviously, the time periods are very different. One of the big differences is that when Europe was going through, is this working? Can you hear me? Yeah. One of the big differences is that when Europe was going through its early phases of modernization and trying to figure out the proper relationship between religion and politics religion and state. One of the big differences is that at that time, we didn't have the existence of these national states as we do today in the Islamic world that have the power to control, to survey, to impose themselves on society and shape the way people think and regulate their behavior. Europe back then the world was very different. What I'm simply saying, the comparison, what's relevant, is that every society that starts to emerge in its modern form and tries to establish some sort of democratic form of rule has to deal with the very difficult question of what role should religion play in this new political system. And this is never an easy process. It's always a difficult one. It involves tension, conflict, debate. Some societies do it violently, some do it more peacefully. So that's really what I was sort of making the argument. Not that the process will be the same. In fact, I believe the process will be fundamentally different. That's why I believe in this concept called multiple modernities. And multiple modernities is a concept that suggests that different societies in different regions of the world will follow different pathways toward their process of modernization. Europe is not the gold standard. And so to assume that because Europe has followed a particular path, every other society has to follow that exact path is fundamentally flawed and misleading, because even if you look at Europe, there were different processes of modernization that took place. The French example and the British example are very different. So that's really the comparison that I was trying to make. I was trying to make that, look, the early phases of modernization and trying to figure out what role religion should play, how much religion you want, you don't want, that inherently is a difficult process. Europe struggled with it, and it was a very bloody process. The Islamic world is struggling with it, and it's going through its own. So I was really trying to say that these conflicts that we're having today over the question of religion, secularism, is natural, is part of the growing process of democracy. And that's something that just has to be, you can't ignore it, you can't pretend it doesn't exist, because religion is a marker of identity. Religion captures people's hearts and minds. That's really the comparison I was making. Your second question, I'm unsure of what exactly you're asking. And so I can't provide an answer until I get some clarity on exactly the point that you were making. It sounds like you were making an interesting and profound point, but you're going to have to re-articulate your question. Is nationalism the religion? Yeah. Okay, so then what's the question? Yeah. Well, I mean, yes, in many ways, you know, the nation state is a religion for many people, and people have a loyalty to it in the same way that people have a loyalty to their religion. These two things exist in the same way. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. It can be a bad thing if it's taken to an extreme. So in the case of the United States, you have these extreme patriots. There's this slogan that you sometimes hear in the United States, America, love it or leave it. If America decides to do something and you're patriotic, there's an expectation that you have to support whatever the state is doing. So in the context of the war in Vietnam, there was this debate that, look, you have to support the troops. You have to support what the United States is doing there, because if you're a citizen, you have to be loyal. The contrary view is actually an interesting argument. They were saying, in the context of the Vietnam War, that being a dissident, being a critic, is sometimes the biggest form of patriotism, because you're pointing out the flaws in a certain argument or policy. And so I would argue that in the context of the United States in the Vietnam War, those people who were much more patriotic to the ideals of the United States were those people who dissented and criticized what the United States was doing in the name of the values of democracy, liberty, freedom, and human rights. I mean, the United States claims to stand for those things, but it wasn't applying those principles in the context of Vietnam. It was trying to subjugate and impose themselves. So yes, this process of nationalism, if that's what your question is, can be very dangerous, and can be very toxic, and can be very, can be used and abused in ways that are extremely dangerous. And we're seeing it right now in these rise of populist movements. I mean, this is what Donald Trump is trying to say in the United States now. Let's make America great again. Let's go back to the old days when everyone was united and everyone sort of saluted the flag. But in those days, America really wasn't as great as it thinks it was. It committed a lot of injustices in the name of patriotic nationalism. We're seeing this today in Putin's Russia. We're seeing this today in many other countries around the world. And so one has to be very careful not to fall into that trap of extreme nationalism. My country, right or wrong. No. My principles, right or wrong. My values, right or wrong. And that sometimes can mean dissenting and criticizing what other people are saying in the name of nationalism. So nationalism can be a very toxic drug that can really lead to a lot of disasters. We're seeing this again in the world today, and the challenge is to try and push back against it.
Do you want to answer this question from Dr. Nader?
It was more of a comment. I would point out that since I raised the question of Tunisia, the Tunisia constitution does not have the term secularism, but the values of secularism are there. But the very first article of the Tunisian constitution says the official religion of Tunisia is Islam. Yes, this is if Tunisia is an Islam, religion, and it's an Arab state. And this was actually an argument that was used to diffuse another crisis that emerged in the early constitutional writing process, when the question of what role should the Sharia play in the Tunisian constitution. And to, I think, Rashid Ghanouchi's credit, he says, look, it's sufficient enough for the first article of the constitution to affirm that the official religion is Islam. We don't want to get into these divisive debates. Islam is protected. It's the identity of the state. But at the same time, in the context of affirming that principle, respect for other religions are enshrined in. And this is another, I think, aspect of constitutional writing that is not sufficiently appreciated. We have democratic political systems that have an official state religion. England, for example, the official religion is Anglicanism, the Church of England. But at the same time, other religions are also equally respected and protected under the law. There's no inherent contradiction. Certain societies have a value that they want to affirm as being foundational to the identity of their society. You can affirm that in the Constitution. The real challenge is to make sure that other religions are also equally protected and have a voice. And I think that's the way you can negotiate these things.
Interestingly, that very small word official had caused some debate as well. In fact, Israeli was attacked verbally by Isham when he said, Article 3.1 is official. He said, Tansri, the word official is not there. So they were splitting hairs with us. And when we look at the Concorde Commission, when Sarawak and Sabah agreed to join Malaysia, their understanding was that Article 3.1 was for officialdom. It was Islam, like in ceremonies, but they conveniently forget that part. So now for us in G25, because it's so difficult to argue with these people who are so bigoted, because the evidence of secularity for Malaya is all in the historical record. Thank God we have the historical records of the Reed Commission. It's very clearly stated that Islam is the religion of the Federation, but all other religions must be, and we have that at 3.2, I think. And at 3.4, they conveniently forget as well. 3.4, 3 bracket 4 says, nothing in this article, what is the word? Derogate. I always forget. Derogate the other articles from the Federal Constitution. And that is something that they don't want to listen to.
Actually, I wanted to make that comment that you made. So since you have made, I wouldn't comment anymore. It's there in the Constitution, but it's created a lot of problems in this part of the country. Yeah, I hope Tunisia would not be having the similar problem later on.
Well, I would just say that what really matters is, and since we have a politician on the panel, we also need good political leaders who can rise above these contentious issues and look and provide arguments that don't drag society down. I mean, I think one reason why Tunisia was successful is because you did have visionary leadership, not just on the Islamic side of the debate, but also on the secular side of the debate. I mean, if you actually follow and you look closely at what happened in Tunisia, and Dr. Ahmad sort of hinted at this, what you actually had was a coalition of moderate Islamists and moderate secularists forming a coalition and holding the center of political space, isolating the extreme secularists and the extreme Islamists who were trying to tear down the political system. That coalition of moderates who both came from a religious perspective and of a secular perspective, but agreed on a basic framing of the constitution and a process, is actually a key reason why the Tunisian democratic transition was successful. And if you actually look closer at that example, the origins of this coalition of moderate religious forces and moderate secular forces actually goes back a decade before the revolution, when in France there was a beginning attempt to break down ideological barriers and a set of meetings before the forces of Ennahda and the forces of different secular parties didn't talk to each other, didn't trust each other, despised each other. But because of these meetings and because of these attempts to break down barriers, they began to form a common vision for the future of Tunisia that actually played a very critical role after the revolution took place. So I think there's actually lessons here that can be learned for other societies that are struggling for democracy, that one of the key challenges here is you have to try and break down ideological barriers from people who are in different camps and normally don't talk to each other. Now, you can't convince everybody. Some people are either motivated and have ideological views that can't be dealt with.
In this context, can I ask a very simple, naive question?
Yeah, please.
How multi-plural is Tunisia?
Ethnically and religiously, you're saying? Yeah, I mean, it's very different. Yeah, no, it's actually very monolithic in the sense that most Tunisians are Arab. They're Arabic speaking. You have a small minority Jewish community. You have a small Berber community, but overwhelmingly, it's very different than Malaysia. So, I mean, in many ways, that does make it a bit easier for Tunisia because you don't have those fault lines that can be exploited.
I really want to be apolitical around here, but let me say this without any, without mincing my word. I was, in a way, privileged, and I've said this so many times, privileged to be with Sheikh Rashid Ghanouchi when he was in political asylum in the UK. Yeah. I was privileged to be, during those times when he was in the UK, and already I could, through the discourses and the encounters and circles that we have with him, we knew it's coming this way. And again, I was in Tunisia when they decided to call themselves Muslim Democrats and sort of making a generational shift from the Islamist, the Islamist construct. And I think Prof. Hashemi, your suggestion earlier, your point earlier, so fundamental to us, Muslims, Democrats, or Islamic Democrat, or neo-Islamist Democrats. It is the ability to relate. And once we break down that wall, and immediately we can already see that what we are really striving for has a lot more common denominator than those little space that we were always, debating and contesting. So yes, what is in question and what is the crux and the bone of contention here in Malaysia is not about religion having a space within the political or the state, but the abuse of religion and the misuse of religion to coerce and through Islamist bureaucracies, agencies that have come to do this is going to be very political, a great disservice to Islam. And I say this without mincing my word. And this is why that dissent, this is why that contestation is so important. And G25 for that matter, when we get to relate to them during the inception from from days of inception, you know, we were warned. We are liberals, so how do you relate with it? I said, look, we are not here to be judgmental. We never come from the holier than thou kind of, relationship. So all the more, I think the forces of, I don't want to call it the forces of moderation. I don't buy to that kind of, But what is important here is, immediately when we see the higher intent and the higher objective, then, we come to, I don't think that, it's necessarily they are against government of the day, they are be with opposition. But the fact that you are striving for that objective of achieving a better Malaysia, that is the traction, in fact. And you can be Islamist or whatever. For as long as you are able to relate, and back to the verses that I said earlier, and that makes my particularly, we want to have an inclusive, progressive, and always engaging approach. Sorry, I've got to be a bit like proselytizing or preaching here, but that's what that's the truth. We want to second to whatever that you have said, and we have seen the best model so far is Rashid Ghanouchi, the Tunisian model, even better than the for the time being, Turkish Erdogan, because of course there's a different context. I think I'll take it at it.
I don't see why the word Islam is contentious in this case. I mean, I can understand whether official or non-official, but I mean, as a Muslim, it should be positive, meaning that you become tolerant because you are Muslim. You become accommodative because you're Muslim. You become compassionate because you're Muslim. So this is not this different idea. Oh, because Islam is there, therefore for Muslims we can impose anything we want. If you remember the Constitution of Medina, actually there were less than 50% who were Muslims. And they chose the Prophet, they chose Muhammad to be the leader. They didn't say he was Prophet, but he became leader. So there were actually non-Muslims who supported the Prophet to become Muslim. To become leader. And therefore, it shows a universal appeal. And I mean, religion should be seen positive in that it makes us more tolerant, more moral. We are limiting our aggression against others just because we are majority. But somehow this extreme and these others use religion the opposite way, and I don't know. As I see it, the failure to argue or to argue your case, you use force instead. And that's a failure of it's an intellectual failure. It's nothing else than that. But as I said, somehow the religion has become a very negative word in this country. It's become a word which we use for imposing rather than actually convincing. It's cajoling people. And used for political power, expediency in most cases. And they don't realize what they're doing to it paints a picture where Islam actually becomes so negative. Rather than a religion of compassion and actually rational rahmatul lil alamin. The whole idea in Malaysia actually, Muslims have less rights than non-Muslims in this country. So
that's a very important point, Isham. Thank you. Yeah. Can I go to the second round and Tan Sri, if you want to have any question? Yeah, and then Dr. Helen, think.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to echo what my colleague Dr. Harima said. That it's really an excellent speech, Dr. Nader Hashemi. I think they all enjoyed your talk, and also, the panel members. I think they've done extremely well to talk about this subject. In my case, perhaps because of my background, I always start with the point that the most important thing for Malaysia, for a Muslim country, and I think it applies to every Muslim country, is that the economy must do well. Because if there is unemployment, if people are hungry, then you can never have peace in the country. But for the economy to do well, it needs good policies.
good macroeconomic policies, good fiscal policies, and all the policies. But the problem comes when the religious side of the country, the religious authorities, try to interfere by coming out with their own version of, by their own version of what is good for the country. And their own version is normally usually the negative way. You shouldn't do this. You're not allowed to do that. You're prohibited from, participating in Christmas celebration. And in a multiracial country like Malaysia, that can divide the society. When there is division in society, none of the good economic policies, can work. And when the economic policies can't work, investors don't have confidence in the country, the ringgit falls. And who suffers when the ringgit falls? The public suffers. So this is why I like your opening statement when you said that there is a very good religion, and there is a good reason for religion, to thrive and to prosper in a country. Because the role of religion is to tell the state leaders what they do wrong and what they do right. But the state must not interfere with what the religious people, with the religious affairs of the country. The problem is that in Malaysia, the state has a very powerful bureaucracy, and using the bureaucracy, the state is using religion as a political tool. And so there are many occasions where I would say, there's contradiction. On the one hand, the government tries to do good policies for the country to encourage the economy, to encourage investors. On the other hand, by interfering on religion, it's undermining its own economic policies. This is the thing that G25 often comes out and reminds the leaders again, that what you are doing is undermining the strength of the economy. Okay, thank you very much.
Helen, concerned citizen and academic. Thank you very much for the lecture. I think the people here are the converted crowd. We all agree with you. Just one question. It's interesting that we brought up this point that in Malaysia at independence, Article 3.1 about religion, about Islam, was understood as a sort of symbolic role, but now it's taking a different scenario, and the constitution had not changed. What changed was the society. What changed the conviction of actors. So I was wondering, if we think about the problem of religion in Malaysia currently, I think maybe the challenge is regarding, what Muslims expect of the state in terms of this religious identity or this so-called protecting Islam. So, for instance, when I look at the different issues or contentions that come out in the society, one of the issues, for instance, is criminalization of the lack of religious practice. If you don't go to the mosque, you can be, punished and so on and so forth. Secondly, moral policing. And then the issues of apostasy, of course, and even policy on public affairs. How should we look at, for instance, whether we allowed beer festival? How should we allow rock concert, which some Muslims may not agree with? Maybe the singer makes some sort of negative remarks about religion. And lastly, of course, the RUU 355 thing. If Muslims believe firmly that, hudud laws should be imposed, and they are the majority. Let's say it's a perfect democracy, and they won. So I don't know. I was thinking from that point of view, how does how could twin toleration provide some sort of answer to this issue? Because it's more, perhaps what Dr. Isham was saying, the interpretation, right, of the belief. But what if this belief is veering towards that? Thank you.
Visible. My name is Julia. I'm just a lay observer passing by. I wanted to first address the question asked by Hasman there, and since Dr. Hashemi mentioned Putin's Russia, it was just too sweet not to comment on, and I'm wearing two ministers here with me today, Minister of Foreign Affairs and Minister of Defense on my back. The question is not exactly that simple, and you mentioned that what's going on today in Putin's Russia. I'm afraid it's not also that simple as Hasman asked, if it is a twofold choice between nationalism and, let's say, Islamism or anything religion-based, because you see what Putin's Russia found itself in 90s. It's quite different. We didn't have to choose to opt for patriotism or nationalism. The population now is being more lost than ever. And in the 90s, I remember they created a special commission in order, and I think this experience, why I'm voicing it, it might be useful for Malaysia in future. They formed a special commission to formulate a national idea. And the only reasonable thing that they were able to, because they really needed to unite people, because people had a kind of religion, which was communism or socialism, whatever it is which we were unable to achieve. The only reasonable idea that they came up with was, do not pee in front of your house. I know it sounds gross, but what is behind it is that you should respect your neighbors. And that was the only one that they thought could unite people back then. But of course it wasn't official. They couldn't come up with something very solid for that. So why I'm talking about this now? Because I think Malaysia will have to tackle this, especially after all these Islamist narratives that will pass, and they will definitely pass. They will not stay alive. I'm so sorry, Dr. Zul. And Malaysia will find itself in a place that it should be this narrative, which even new parties are championing. This narrative now will have to be replaced by something. And it will be a time of disarray. It will be a time that people will have to gather together and really think how we can build a nation without the religion, without this religious zeal, but a healthy nation which is united by the feeling of having something together. And for Malaysia, it will be even more complicated. And again, I'm seeing what a complicated experience in a vast country as my own we are having. We are still having 20 years after the Soviet Union is gone, almost 30. My question actually was to you, Dr. Zul, because I've been long enough here to observe how beautifully you quote the Quran, and we speak about the noble causes. But the problem is, even if the new political party, as you are currently supporting, and if it comes to power, I'm afraid that with this quoting of the Quran, at best case, you will be sitting somewhere on the bench next to it and advising to the politicians what they should do. Where the problem lies is that we always quote these beautiful phrases, but we never talk about building an effective institutional system, about adding on whether new institutions, working institutions, or removing some rudimentary and not working, but still having a very huge budgets, right? If we speak of the university that Dr. Isham is representing here, if you go there, you notice that how people are not fond of speaking of any kind of concrete things like methodology, and especially when it comes to institutions, again, they say, no, it's enough to have taqwa. It's enough for the righteous people to come to power. But when you ask about institutions, what kind of institutions? It's all coming from the West. And we are ending up with the antithesis, which we started at the reading session yesterday, at contraposing ourselves to the West with its failing institutions, and we don't need that. We just need righteous people. So the question is, which I'm finally reaching to, is about the institutions. When we start speaking about effective institutions, when we start arranging our mind in terms of methodology. Thank you.
This is an opportunity for me to really expound something that I really, okay, 2 minutes. That's a challenge for politicians to always speak short. Well, I must make a confession. I'm a great believer of institutional economics. I'm not country Sharif is an economist, although I am not, but I have a lot of passion for economics right from my undergraduate days in the UK. I'm a great believer of institutional economics, particularly the new institutional economics of Professor Douglas North, that you know very well, or maybe not know, is a Nobel laureate on economics. And that new institutional economics premise and hinges on the reform of institutions as the driving force of reform. It's just not the market institution or financial institution, the regulatory institution, the entire institution of check and balance of the executive by, of course, the legislators and the judiciary, which are now it's falling apart, right? Because of the usurpation of power by the executive. Now, it's good that you bring up this subject, because if we just give the impression that we are just talking and talking, of course, we wouldn't want us to live there, because the entire manifesto that we presented at state level and federal level is all about reforms. And of course, one critical reforms are institutional reforms. Okay, and you give me 1 hour, I can expound on this. But rest assured, that this is, because at the end of the day, it's all about action. God says, وَقُلْ اعْمَلُوا فَسَيَرَ اللَّهُ عَمَلَكُمْ وَرَسُولُهُ do, because Allah, Rasul, and the entire believers and humanity will look at you. So what matters is what you do rather than what you talk. And there's a great verse in the Quran that really reprimanded those who talk and do not want to do, or those you do things that you don't talk. Grave, in the eyes of God, you don't walk your talk. So it's a great reminder for me, particularly. Your reminder is certainly very important. You get a chance, we are roaring to go for this reform, and we want to have the citizens, the Raya, to be the greatest check and balance for us. Immediately we go astray, bring us down. That should be the cardinal element in the Quran is the cardinal verse in the Quran talks about check and balance. Prophet Nazir would quote this verse. Had not God Almighty check and balance the aggression and transgression of those by others, the entire world would be in destruction as it is now. Because you stop to check and balance people in power. So I think be a bit more merciful and talking to people like me, because we are all for reform, and the reform, primary institutional reform. Of course, there's no institution. The role of religion is said by country, rightly said that the role of religion at its minimum is to address that greed and dishonesty of leaders that come about to trigger all this global financial crisis, food crisis, environmental crisis, and all other crises that you witness in this world because of greed and dishonesty. And you have it. So embedded of hypocrisy. So I think I will stop it. Because otherwise you will go off tangent to be a political speaker. I thank you.
With respect to your question, what can Alfred Stepan's thesis on the twin tolerations teach us in terms of dealing with some of the crises in Malaysia, with rising religious intolerance and ultra-conservatism? There's a part of the thesis that I didn't talk about that speaks directly to your question, and it also speaks to the comments that we heard from Dr. Isham. And that is the question of the multivocality of religions. All religions have multiple voices that are constantly trying to win adherence to their interpretation. And Stepan says explicitly that in the struggle for democracy and in the struggle to consolidate democracy, it's incredibly important for those religious voices that have a solid democratic commitment to challenge the more puritanical, intolerant, and extremist voices. To not allow one group to claim that they are the spokesperson for religion and everyone else is irreligious. If you do that, you're going to lose the game. So part of the challenge and the struggle in societies where there is religious groups that are trying to use politics to their own advantage is to not concede to them that their interpretation is the only interpretation, is to push back and to advance publicly convincing arguments that are rooted in a religious foundation, but the interpretation is more inclusive, more democratic, more just, more equitable. If you don't do that, then the group that is able to shout the loudest or manipulate state institutions will always win the game of claiming that their interpretation is the only authentic one and everyone else is inauthentic. So that's an incredibly, I think, important lesson to learn, not just for Malaysia, but to other societies. And of course, those political parties that have control of the state have an interest in silencing other religious voices. So in the case of Saudi Arabia today, in the case of the Islamic Republic of Iran today, the jails in those two countries are filled with dissident religious voices who reject the interpretation, who have criticized the ruling policies of these regimes. Because these regimes claim to be Islamic, they claim to justify their legitimacy, and their biggest threat is from those people who are saying, wait a second, your interpretation of Islam is not the only one. In fact, in many ways, it's probably a false one or a weak one. So I think part of the challenge here is to really support and advance arguments that are Islamically authentic, but at the same time are much more just and democratic and equitable in terms of their political program and their vision.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nader, Zul, and Isham. I think before we end our session today, I'll invite Brother Ihsan, our chairperson, to perhaps give some gifts to our speakers and also to make some announcement for our next events, 3 events with you, right? Ihsan? Yes.
Thank you, distinguished speakers, Prof. Nader, Dr. Isham, and of course, Dr. Dzulkefly Ahmad. I would like to call for one round of applause. I think it's a very interesting discussion indeed. We have covered critical points, critical perspective of discussions during our session today. And of course, as mentioned by Dr. Farouk, we are going to have following discussions on different topics, also related topics in tomorrow. There's going to be another forum tomorrow on Islam, liberty and Islamic value, another interesting topic indeed as well. And on Monday, there's going to be another session on is whether authoritarianism is related to religiosity. Quite a complicated topic. Is religiosity related to authoritarianism? Even for me to pronounce the topic is already quite challenging. So you could expect the challenge, how interesting the discussion would be. Okay, anyway, just to end up, I would like to thank the speakers again. So because of that, we would like to give the book that we've already translated as a token of appreciation. I would like to ask Afika to help, and I would like to invite as well one of the board of directors of IRF, brother, we call him Sean Shazwan, his famous name. Yeah, Okay, first of all, I'd like to invite Prof. Nader Hashemi to receive the book. Dr. Isham, thank you very much. And of course, Dr. Dzulkefly Ahmad, thank you. And next, Dato Saifuddin Abdullah. And next, Yang Berhormat YB Sa'ari Sungit to receive also the honor.
For writing the blurb for the book.
Okay, thanks again. Thank you, everyone. And as I mentioned just now, we do like to invite you all to attend our next coming sessions tomorrow afternoon, also here in Concorde. And the one on Monday, it will be in Nottingham University, both in the afternoon. Okay, those who have already registered, we would like to invite you to join our tea session in the coffee house downstairs. Hope to see you again tomorrow. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.